Russians are preparing for at least 6 more years of Vladimir Putin after he secured an inevitable landslide victory in the country's presidential election. The race offered no real alternative, considering Putin's opponents are either dead, jailed, exiled, barred from running, or handpicked. Most notably missing, Alexei Navalny, who died in a Russian penal colony 1 month ago. During a victory speech, Putin made an unprecedented break with his tradition of not saying Navalny's name. He not only spoke about his late rival's mysterious death, but he confirmed reports about a proposal to exchange Navalny in a prisoner swap just days before the opposition leader died. Let's listen.
The person who spoke to me had not finished his sentence yet when I said I agree. But unfortunately, what happened, happened. There was only one condition: for him not to come back. Let him sit there.
Let's discuss with Steve Hall. He's the former CIA chief for Russia operations, also a CNN national security analyst. Steve, thanks for being with us this afternoon. What struck me most about Putin's remarks were his references to Navalny. He called his death sad, but then he went on to say that there are other cases where people in prisons pass away. I'm curious from your perspective, why invoke Navalny's name now?
Well, Boris, it's a lot easier to invoke somebody as dangerous to Vladimir Putin as Navalny was after you've effectively killed him, or your system has done so by simply putting him in, this gulag prison system that the Russians have. So I think it is indeed striking that before his death, Putin was either afraid or did not want the general public to be thinking that strongly about Navalny, and so he didn't use his name. Now, of course, he's saying, well, yes, this was Navalny. It was all very unfortunate, which, of course, like everything else that comes out of the Kremlin, is essentially false. So that's no big surprise there. It's also no big surprise that Vladimir Putin is trying to find some sort of moral equivalence between, occasionally there's a death in a Russian prison. That happens in the United States and other places, which, of course, is indeed ridiculous, like, again, everything else that comes out of the Kremlin these days.
To that point about a lot of ridiculous things coming from Vladimir Putin's mouth, he was talking about America's so-called, in his words, so-called democratic system, saying the U.S. judicial system has become, quote, ridiculous and a disgrace. That sounds like propaganda for Donald Trump.
Yeah, Putin and the Kremlin, and his spokespeople are so good at this. They understand where the tension points are in not only our own democracy, but in other Western democracies. And so you'll hear things like, well, there's a lot of problems with U.S. elections. There's problems with the U.S. legal system, because he knows that, as a free-thinking Western society, we say, maybe we have to think about that. That's exactly what he's trying to do. He also, of course, it's really no surprise, or should be no surprise, that Vladimir Putin would very much rather see Donald Trump as the next president, because Donald Trump is saying things like, well, let's let the Russians do whatever the hell they want in whatever NATO country they want. We're not going to come to their assistance. And the current president, Biden, is saying precisely the opposite and trying to strengthen these alliances. So again, it's very beneficial for Putin to have somebody like a Donald Trump in the White House as opposed to a Biden.
Steve, on the question of NATO, there was speculation that Putin was waiting until after his reelection to institute another mobilization, effectively a military draft in Russia. Do you expect that to be the case? How do you see the timing of this election now altering the landscape of the battlefield in Ukraine?
Really not a bit, because, of course, it wasn't really an election. It was a Potemkin Village performance. And so to sort of ascribe any of the typical language that we normally use about elections is again, what Putin would like. There is always a little bit of stability tension in Russia around the time of when they put on this performance where they bring out the ballot boxes and people line up. And so I think Putin probably was waiting, because that's a greater probability or possibility for people to take to the streets, which, of course, in Russia, Putin pays close attention to. Now that that's all sort of behind him, I think some of these more unpopular things, coupled with some very popular things that he might try to do to avoid people coming out onto the streets. But, if Russia is going to be serious about winning convincingly finally in Ukraine, there is going to have to be increased pressure for him to call up more Russian young people who are inevitably going to die in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in Ukraine.
Steve Hall, appreciate your perspective. Thanks for being with us.
CNN was near Russian polling sites outside the country on the final day of voting Sunday, including one in Berlin, where Alexei Navalny's widow waited hours to submit her ballot. Our Frederick Pleiken spoke with Russian voters making their voices heard against Vladimir Putin.
Yulia Navalnaya was certainly the most prominent of the opposition activists who came here to the Russian embassy in Berlin to vote in the Russian presidential election.
You are probably wondering what I wrote on the ballot papers, who I voted for. Of course, I wrote Navalny's surname, because it just can't be so that a month before the election and already during the presidential campaign, Putin's main opponent, already imprisoned, was murdered.
Of course, the Russian opposition had called on Russian voters both inside the country, inside Russia, and outside of the country, so expats, to go to the embassies at 12 p.m. in their respective time zones and to vote in the Russian election for anybody but Vladimir Putin.
There could be no any negotiations and nothing with Mr. Putin, because he is a killer, he is a gangster, he is the person who brought my country to the war.
At the same time, what you have here in Berlin is you also have a big demonstration that took place also, and you had scenes here where at times there were anti-Putin protesters on the one side screaming at some of the voters on the other side, and there were thousands of people who lined up here at the embassy in Berlin, some of them clearly pro-Putin, but also a lot of them clearly against Vladimir Putin, and some of them even with gear in the colors of Ukraine. Now, I was able to speak to opposition activist Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and here's what he had to say.
We have the only opportunity to show by going to polling stations at the same time as those who oppose Putin and those who oppose the war that we are the majority. And this is important inside Russia. It's important for those Russians who are inside other countries today, because Putin's propaganda is trying to convince, including Western public opinion, that all Russians are in favor of war.
Just like here in Berlin, Russian expats around the world voted in their respective embassies. And the scenes that we saw here in the German capital is that some people needed hours to actually be able to get into the actual polling station because so many people were lining up. Fred Pleiken, CNN, Berlin.
Fascinating to see that. Frederick, thank you. Joining me now is world-renowned Russian writer Boris Akunin. Boris, thank you so much for your time. First off, I just want to get your reaction to, of course, these election results that were widely expected. No one is surprised. The Western world condemning it, saying that it was based on repression and intimidation. The White House saying that this election was neither free or fair. We all know that. What is your reaction?
Well, I should say, a bit surprised by all the attention that the world has been paying to these so-called elections, because people inside Russia, they were yawning. They knew that it meant nothing, that it changed nothing. It was like, elections in Nazi Germany or elections in the USSR, just a meaningless show, nothing else.
It may mean nothing to some people, but to obviously Vladimir Putin, it's everything, isn't it? I mean, to him, he's seeing this as a referendum on the war, and he's using it to say, hey, look at this country is 87% behind me and what I'm about to do next.
Exactly. That's what it was all about. This whole expensive show was just for one spectator, Vladimir Putin. This was done by his entourage to show that the dictator, that he is really supported, that he is genuinely loved. And when I looked at Vladimir Putin yesterday making his victory speech, I felt sort of sorry for him, because he honestly believes in this, what was it, 87%, 187% they drew for him. He honestly believes in it. This is the world he lives in. He's probably the only person in the world who believes in these elections.